us from. We're so excited to have you join our webinar today. We'll make sure to record and provide this information to you. So with that said, I think we're at 10:02 or 2 past the hour. We want to make sure that we're being mindful of your time. I am going to end the poll and then turn it over to our speaker, Rachel Wells. So thank you again for joining us.
Thanks, Shana. It's so exciting to see so many folks who are from the nonprofit or social sector, both new to data science and with data science experience. It seems like we're equal parts there from the welcome question. So glad to have you all at our first Nonprofit Data 101 event. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm Rachel Wells. I manage the Center of Excellence at DataKind, which means I ensure all of our projects are high quality, ethical, impactful, all that good stuff. And I make sure that all of our nonprofit partners and folks in the nonprofit and social sectors are able to do excellent project work in the data space. So our agenda for today is getting started with an introduction of what this event is all about, a little bit about DataKind, and then we'll dive straight into the components of a successful data science for good project. And then the bulk of the time will be spent in a tutorial on building your problem statement. And so that will incorporate these 6 different pieces that we think are essential to scoping data projects, from impact maps to ethics with human-centered design and product sustainability and more in between. Then we'll share more information. It's a lot of content for the next 55 minutes, but we'll have follow-up places for you to find more information afterwards, and we'll share the recording and then dive into some questions and answers. So with that, let's get started. I'll do my best to monitor the chat as we're going, but there will be time for questions at the end too. So if you put your question in the chat now, I'll probably get to it later. So we are a global nonprofit that works with volunteers and partner organizations with the mission to harness the power of data science and AI in the service of humanity. And we help social organizations identify their data and AI opportunities, which is the main thing that we'll be talking about today. But we also recruit and manage teams of volunteer experts to actually build those solutions and then stick around afterwards to partner with organizations who have their solutions built and make sure their impact is achieved. And some of you might be in that camp here who have partnered with us in the past, and some of you might be completely new to the idea of exploring a project in DataKind scoping process. We do project work all around the world. We have 5 global chapters that do a lot of work locally, but we have projects and volunteers across the continents. And in 2020, so I launched and have since been leading DataKind's Center of Excellence, which is a cross-discipline team of staff and volunteers committed to creating an ecosystem of excellence across all of our work and supporting social sector organizations so they can do excellent data work. So this can include co-creating resources with the DataKind community and the broader data in the nonprofit space, experimenting, learning, facilitating learnings, trainings like this one, where we're enabling others in the social sector, measuring and evaluating our work, and directly supporting organizations. And so as part of the Center of Excellence, we are now launching Nonprofit Data 101, which is what you're here at today, to help build nonprofits and social sector data capacity. So this new program involves the 1-hour webinar that you're currently attending, as well as the option to participate in free 30-minute one-on-one consultations with DataKind volunteer experts after the event. So today is the official launch of this new program, and we're so excited and glad that you've joined us for this big day. But with that in mind, we're also eager to hear your feedback after our webinar today, and then after you attend office hours next week, so we can ensure this offering is modified to maximize the value to you all as social sector professionals interested in using data. So we hope to both educate and create a safe space in the office hours for you to discuss data science, its applications, opportunities, and concerns. So that brings us to our topic for today. Our very first Nonprofit Data 101 topic is data project scoping. In future weeks, in future events, we will have different topics, but today we'll talk all about scoping a data project. And so over the next hour, you'll learn to identify your data scienceable problem and map it to your organization's theory of change. which can be summarized in a problem statement that will resonate with data and social sector professionals and can be used to design data for good proposals in a way that ensures ethical innovation so that you can establish a strong project scoping process in your organization and ultimately, hopefully, develop better programs and scale benefits for greater impact in the communities you serve. So to do this, we'll walk through applying DataKind's approach to scoping, sharing real nonprofit project examples throughout. So this brings us to our goal. Let's address the question, how do we use data science to create solutions that serve the good of the many, of the most vulnerable people? Unfortunately, finding problems can not only be harder than finding solutions, it can also be much more important in making a positive change. So over a decade at DataKind, we've experienced many instances of problems that were difficult to define. So how do you measure bringing people out of poverty or increasing social justice and equity? So identifying the root problems causing social injustices is really often nearly impossible. And that's why we prioritize and are starting this series with scoping. The answer to how we might use data science for good is all about building a solution that's scalable by defining your problem well. So it's about that work that you put in upfront. So now we've introduced why we're talking about data project scoping, what the event is that you're at today as a new offering at DataKind, and we can dive into the 6 components for success in a data for good proposal. So first, there are a number of options for how to ensure you have skilled data professionals on board. So DataKind, this is one of the things that we provide, pro bono data scientists. But you also might be identifying data science talent through a corporate partner or by hiring data staff, all great options. And some of you might be data scientists yourself, I believe, and this is where you fit in. So this is your role here. And so even if you are a data scientist, you might want to work with other data scientists who have complementary data skills, which is a common model for us with our partners. So the next component for nonprofits is essential to find donors who are willing to invest in data science with you. So if you're in a government or a for good private organization, this could mean just getting budget or buy-in from leadership to ensure you have sufficient funding for your data project. Now we have social actors and subject matter experts. These folks are key to identifying the right problem to address and co-designing data solutions. So they answer the question, are the problems we are addressing the ones that actually matter? Without them, there's no way data scientists would be able to build solutions that improve our world. So find subject matter experts to work with you if you're a social change agent or data scientist, or find those social actors who are on the ground doing the work to partner with you if you are a subject matter expert or a data scientist. So no matter what, you want to get a deep understanding of the needs and know that you're actually solving for what's most important to solve for. And that's done by getting to know the people that your data work will impact. And so this leads us to our last 2 components, which are what we're going to focus on today, problem statements and data. So this brings us into the bulk of our presentation, how to build your problem statement. And we're going to include details on how to incorporate all of these key elements of scoping that you see here. But we'll get started with a very simple project concept statement template. So we use this for all of our projects at DataKind and are so excited to be sharing it openly with you today. And we'll spend time returning to the statement and gradually filling it in. But be careful, we don't start filling it in at the top. We're going to start at the very end with the impact you're trying to achieve. And this is how we ensure, as we just discussed, that we're addressing problems that truly make an impact. And this brings us to our first consideration in scoping a data science for good problem, impact maps. So you may want to ask, well, what data should I collect, Rachel? Or, oh, I've got this data, X data. What do I do next now that I have this data? But if we want to address truly important challenges and serve the good of the most vulnerable, we need to start with addressing the right problems instead of starting with the data. So this is how we identify that so what impact at the bottom of our project statement template. So we want to hear about what success looks like for you. Use the brainstorming questions shown here to identify what the impact that you want to make is. So what change do you want to see in the world? What does the world look like when your team has fulfilled its mission? What's most important in your organization or community? The answer to all of these questions will ultimately go into the end of the problem statement to demonstrate the impact that we want to make. This is maybe the easiest part for you, since you probably already know what you're trying to achieve, but I'll share an example that we'll go back to throughout the webinar. So you might be trying to address poverty through a financial inclusion program for rural farmers. And so therefore, the impact you are interested in making is that subsistence farmers break out of the cycle of poverty. Great job. You just filled it. We filled in our first blank. So that Ugandan subsistence farmers break out of the cycle of poverty. Or maybe as a second example, you're interested in ensuring humanitarian aid gets to those who need it the most. Once again, we filled in our first blank. This big impact goes at the bottom of the problem statement. So now we can move on to the next one. Next, we think about what behavior change, we're moving up, what behavior change we want to make to move the needle on our desired impact. So in order to determine the behavior change that you want to happen so that you can have your desired impact, you need to understand how every activity you do maps to your mission. So this is what these brainstorming questions are getting at. Ask yourself, what's the process for achieving this vision? How do you map your activities to your mission? The answer to this question for most social sector organizations is their theory of change or logic model. So at DataKind, what we call an impact map, what we're talking about right now, is really how the data science project fits into your logic model or theory of change, and thus maps to the impact made. Some of you might not be familiar with these terms. You might be thinking, logic model, theory of change? Don't know what that is, but don't worry, you can just Google it. There are many great resources available online. There are consultants that would be happy to help and study your theory of change or logic model to identify that behavior change that you want to make so that you can move the needle on your desired impact. So as you scan your theory of change, you'll likely see several options of things that can go here. Keep thinking creatively and come up with several different options. What change do you want to make that will end up completing your vision? So here are some brainstorming questions to consider as you evaluate. Look for areas in your theory of change that someone could really just pick apart the theory of change and question, does this really imply that? Find those bottlenecks, the pain points, and document everything in a way that might be anything that might be standing in your way as a change that you might want to make in your problem statement. So let's go back to our examples. Say you're trying to address poverty in Uganda through financial inclusion, and your desired impact is that Ugandan subsistence farmers break out of the cycle of poverty. So some potential behavior changes could be in a few different directions here based on what you've identified as areas for improvement in your theory of change. So this is great to have several options. We've got 3 options. So first, maybe it would be great if a micro-lending program's operations became more efficient. Or maybe services could be targeted better to the farmers that are experiencing the most extreme poverty. That's the middle option. Or maybe financial service providers need to be able to get to remote villages more quickly so they can serve more people. So all of these potential behavior changes map to the ultimate impact of subsistence farmers breaking out of the cycle of poverty. So these are all options of things that could go in the problem statement. So we see an example of that here. So services can be targeted to the poorest farmers experiencing the most extreme poverty so that Ugandan subsistence farmers break out of the cycle of poverty. So we'll look at our other project example. Let's say our desired impact is ensuring humanitarian aid gets to those who need it the most. Now your impact map may look like we just saw, where you have 3 different buckets of areas you could use for improvement, or it could be more of a long chain of events, a chain of reaction type of theory of change. And you may notice that it has more element than just one, and your bottleneck or your challenge is kind of further down that chain, that series of events. So here's an example of that. Many humanitarian organizations know they can more effectively get aid to those who need it the most if they're able to provide complementary services or serve different geographic areas rather than duplicating efforts. So they also found that more effective allocation of resources across organizations is required to provide these complementary services. And taking it back further, in order to more effectively allocate resources, organizations need to share data that can be used to make the decisions. So therefore, in order to effectively allocate resources, after sharing data and using data to make decisions, they want to make the behavior change of sharing access across organizations to all relevant information for crisis response. And so that is what goes into the problem statement as the behavior change. So bringing it back to our problem statement, we see that we want to do something using some data so that humanitarian organizations have access to all the relevant information for a crisis response so that ultimately humanitarian aid can be delivered to those who need it. So with some changes mapped out, it's time to move to the top and decide what analysis we want to do. This brings us to the most important scoping consideration for analysis of technical feasibility. And this can sometimes be the hardest leap to make. But we'll start with some brainstorming questions as usual to help you determine the analysis you might want to do for your project statement. If you're comfortable with data science, you can ask yourself what projects might create the desired behavior change. But if you're not, if you're new to the data space, just ask yourself questions like, who might be the users of a solution you build? How might they use it? What could a dream world look like? So if you're not comfortable with data science, or even if you are, a useful place to start is simply asking yourself the analytical timeframe of interest. So consider first what you could gain from better understanding the past, or what would be useful to know or automate in real time to improve the present, or what do you want to be able to predict before it happens in the future? It can also be helpful to think about these three buckets that data science projects tend to fall into. So first, counting and reporting is an essential first step for all organizations on a data journey. Next, testing and modeling. It's popular for predicting the future or identifying the impact of a program with a randomized control trial. Finally, once you've got the statistics and importantly, the ethics down, you may consider asking yourself what can be automated through machine learning or AI. So ask yourself, what can a computer do so that we can free up more time for humans to be humans? So we'll quickly go through some examples of how we have used machine learning at data science that might inspire you to come up with ideas for what you will do with your problem statement as you're scoping projects. First, find out how many people are likely to be in need of housing support in a city next month through predictive modeling. Plan a route for a driver to visit the most hospitals as fast as possible by automating a laborious task. Decide what food pantry needs donations the most by optimizing resource allocation. Discover what material a farmer's roof is made out of and therefore their likely poverty level through analyzing satellite images. These are all ideas for analysis that you might want to do filling in that first line of your project statement. So you should come up with as many ideas as you can because data access will likely narrow down your options. Or with ethical examination, you might find there's unintended consequences of project success for some of your ideas. So we'll narrow down to selecting one project when we talk about data and ethics. Remember the 6 components that we started this session with? Well, strategizing on possible data solutions, it's important to research and to ensure existing solutions are evaluated so you're not reinventing the wheel, right? So this is an essential time, as always, to work closely with social sector, subject matter experts, and social actors on the ground to ensure that the data projects you're suggesting are the right fit for addressing the challenges that your end users are facing. So don't assume that since you're at the data science part deciding on the data science project, the data scientist can take over. The data scientist will never fully take over. It needs to consistently be collaborative. So let's go back to our examples. starting with our financial inclusion organization that wants to help farmers break out of poverty. We came up with 3 sample possible behavior changes that everyone agrees will lead to the desired impact. And we'll look now at a sample data project for each of these 3 examples. And these are actually all references to real projects that DataKind has done. So Grameen Foundation came to DataKind wanting to measure whether bikes increase efficiency enough to justify a new program using bikes to give support for financial inclusion programs to farmers. So our project helped Grameen decide to cut the program because it wasn't providing as much value to the farmers as they hoped. So because of this data-based decision, they were able to use their resources more effectively. With both Microcred in Senegal and Simpa Networks in India and other organizations, we've built alternative credit scoring techniques so that we can predict future loan repayments that allow these organizations to reach previously overlooked populations. And sometimes after you've identified that so what behavior change and impact, so your data source can be helpful in helping you decide what project you want to complete. So GiveDirectly knew they had access to satellite imagery data, and they wanted to look at roofs to identify the poorest households in Uganda. Of course, this only works because the project statement maps to their desired behavior and impact change. So let's go back to our humanitarian aid organization that works towards getting aid to those who need it the most. And it wants to increase access to all relevant information for crisis response across the sector. So DataKind actually worked with 3 organizations towards this aim on a project that kicked off last year. And the team wanted to identify and consolidate relevant data into one cross-organization accessible interface so that organizations have access to relevant information for a crisis response so that humanitarian aid gets to those who need it the most. So technical feasibility is all about defining the key deliverables and outputs and confirming that it's possible to achieve them with the designed methodology, the capacity on your team, and the existing data. This brings us to our next key consideration for scoping, human-centered design. So we have a few principles of human-centered design that we apply to all of our scoping efforts. First, communication and people always come first. We have a no jargon standard. We have people who know a lot about APIs, people who know a lot about SDGs, and a problem we run into is when we let people assume that other people understand the alphabet soup. So we explain everything and we all act as translators of our areas of expertise. Most importantly, as I mentioned when we talked about the 6 components of a Data for Good project, we design with and not for. So if you don't have an end user of the solution engaged with the design, you'll likely end up with a solution that just sits on a shelf or is never used. Even worse, you may have a solution that's implemented in a way that does harm. So this is why it's key to incorporate communities impacted by your work into your scoping process. Your users should help you write your problem statement. Incorporating good design principles into your project is what's going to take us from that initial excitement of a cool, flashy data science AI project to one that actually has real, lasting, positive change. So writing your problem statement is all about doing your research before you come up with the ideas of what you want to do and carefully designing in partnership with on-the-ground social actors and subject matter experts. So you might be wondering why you need to think about product sustainability. Why was that included on the list during this very initial stage? The key of this is because you don't want to propose anything that's not sustainable. So it's really essential to have your sustainability plan mapped from the start. We shouldn't always be satisfied with a solution that just worked once, because true value can come from long-term replication, being able to do it again to learn more next time, and scale that enables systems change. So your project should have reusability, different applicability, where we can share learnings or lessons and reapply those learnings elsewhere. All of that should be built in from the start. So here are some brainstorming questions to consider as you think about product sustainability. What are the environmental conditions of the final solution? How fast will the solution be outdated? Is your organization prepared to support the product after the project is complete? Is your organization ready to accept and integrate the results, even if they reflect potentially uncomfortable deficiencies or changes in how you should operate? So if the answer is no to either of these last two questions, you need to really reconsider the project you're thinking about doing so you can ensure you're doing a project that will provide value. So we just talked about local context alongside human-centered design, but I would be remiss to not mention it again here, because this is where your solution will break down if you haven't built with the users within the local context. The product will fail to sustain if you don't incorporate communities impacted during scoping. So now that we've incorporated technical feasibility, human-centered design, and product sustainability into our problem statement, we've covered a lot in 30 minutes. It's time to talk about data. Since we never finished our problem statement, we still have one blank left to fill in. So how do we find the data? Now, you might be surprised to see us getting to the data last, but as we've mentioned, we believe it's important to start with the problem, not the data, to ensure the work you're doing will actually make an impact. But first, to find data, take stock of the data that your organization has, exploring all internal source options in departments you might not traditionally go to, as well as those that you would expect to house helpful data. So think creatively about the data you might find useful to address the problem statement you've identified. Next, once you've exhausted all internal data options, it's time to consider publicly available data, frequently referred to as open source data. And this brings us to number 2 on our list of open data sources. So to start summarizing some examples of open data sources, we'll use the context of this project to help humanitarian aid organizations that work towards getting aid to those who need it the most. So there are tons of options of open source relevant data available from multinational organizations, both at a countrywide, macro level, and the individual household or person level. So the UN, the IMF, World Bank, regional organizations all have tons of useful open data on employment, peacekeeping, much more. This is one of the sources that we brought together for our humanitarian data project to get aid to those who need it the most. Additionally, most governments have publicly available data on their statistics department website. A few of them are listed here, but all of which are pretty easy to find. Try just typing open data and whatever country name you have into Google search. If that doesn't work, you simply need to know what your country calls their statistics department or Ministry of Statistics, or central banks or other departments can also be good sources for data on the topics that they cover. So we also brought in some country level data for this humanitarian project. And finally, our largest data source for this project was the Humanitarian Data Exchange, disaster response, data on aid workers, and lots of humanitarian response to COVID data can be found on the Humanitarian Data Exchange. So DataKind is merging these and other open data sources and finding the keys to bring them together as part of this problem statement. So to complete our first official finalized full problem statement, we want to identify and consolidate relevant data into one cross-organization accessible interface using open data sources from humanitarian response data from multiple jurisdictions, so that humanitarian organizations have access to relevant information for crisis response, so that humanitarian aid can be delivered to those who need it the most. Great job, we've completed a problem statement. So with that, once we've exhausted our internal data sources and our open data sources, it's time to start thinking about overlooked data sources and unique ways that you can collect data. So we'll start with exciting new overlooked data sources, of course, include things like sensors and drones and the Internet of Things. You're also probably familiar with a good old-fashioned survey. So this is still an important way of collecting data in many cases. But in the spirit of discussing overlooked data, I'll talk specifically about crowdsourcing and social surveying. These methods cannot guarantee a sample of respondents that accurately reflects the population of interest. So it's not a good tool for building a predictive model that really relies on representation. But still, crowdsourcing and social surveying are great places to start if you have a limited budget, you're in the project design stage, and you're dealing with restrictions because of COVID, as it can be done 100% online. So just be mindful to check your demographics for representation and ensure that all types of people in your population of interest are represented in the data you collect. You don't want to do a project that's meant to target women and do a crowdsourced survey that only men participate in. Not very useful, right? You need to check for representation. Metadata is the data about the data. It has been around for a long time, but is often overlooked. So consider what metadata you might have both internally and alongside public data sets, and think carefully about how you might use it. And then digital exhaust is the trail that someone leaves as they explore the internet. So if your users are engaging with you digitally, if you have a digital experience, look into data exhaust as a potential data source to better understand how your users are navigating your tool and exploring and interacting with you online. Of course, only use this data if you've received consent from the users to do so. Web scraping is relatively easy and converts the internet into data, but make sure to check the legality of your project before you start, because there are many restrictions on what you can and cannot scrape. So be careful to educate yourself on the source's rules and regulations. For example, as part of the humanitarian data project we just shared about, one of our teams incorporated some open Facebook data to overlay movement during COVID. One website that you can scrape data from is Google. So if you're interested in search results, you can turn any ranking of Google searches into open data. Now let's get back to our other example, the financial inclusion organization that wants to help farmers break out of poverty. We've now identified a few open data source options for microcred in Senegal and Simpa networks in India, in addition to the internal private banking customer behavior data. So the DataKind team combined this information with public government data, giving household financial norms, as well as sector performance data from financial multinational organizations. So all these data combined contributed to the predictive models built as outlined in this problem statement. Satellite imagery data is another overlooked data source that is available to help through many open sources and can be helpful for all kinds of projects. One example is Open Aerial Map. It's a really great source that includes data covering much of the globe. And there's also Landsat by NASA. And that's a great resource for open satellite imagery data in the US in particular. We also used open satellite data for the humanitarian response project mentioned earlier. But another example of using open source satellite imagery data is that project with Give Directly, in which we want to identify the poorest households in Uganda using roof materials identified in satellite images. So now that we have all these great data sources available, how should we evaluate the sources and decide which ones to actually use? So before deciding to do a project, always conduct an inventory and review of the state and quality of the proposed data sets to be used, and verify that there's enough promising data available and ready to go for analysis to bring your ideas to life. So we call this auditing the data, or a data audit. Consider the following brainstorming questions as you decide whether to use the data you found. So how was the data set collected? How much is there? Is it well defined? What are the most likely biases that could be in the data? What data are you missing, and how might that influence project outcomes? If these are starting to sound to you maybe just as much as ethical questions as data source questions, then you are right. It's impossible to separate selecting your data source from ensuring ethics is incorporated into our data project, which brings us to our final consideration for scoping your data project, ethics. So the next 5 minutes is certainly far from enough time to provide a comprehensive data ethics training. So be aware that this is only meant to provide some guiding principles. I encourage you to explore this topic more as you consider your data project, and we'll provide a resource for doing that next. So the bottom line is that you shouldn't suggest automating anything if you haven't thought carefully about ethics. But what does this mean? How do we consider ethics, privacy, and risk from the start? This sounds simplistic, but a big part of data ethics is to talk it out, deliberate what the possible implications could be, ensuring there's space to discuss, revise, and veto as needed projects that could impose undue risks to people. Ethics is a process. It's not a destination. It must be approached with thoughtfulness to affirmatively create space to pause and collaboratively ask hard questions. Never just assuming that we have one ethical checklist to success. This checklist will accomplish everything. So account for vulnerable stakeholders and consider who might be missing from your data. Systematically ask whether an algorithm directly or indirectly sorts and acts upon people according to social or political power. So who lives downstream from your data set? Who's excluded? In the example earlier about men and women, what about folks who are non-binary or don't identify in either of those camps? Are you intentionally using historical proxies for race, class, or gender, like in the US zip code? Will your algorithm exacerbate unjust social or political dynamics, or will it actually help resolve them? What biases are built into that data set that you are considering working with? So we've all seen these questions pop up. Just because you can do it, should you do it? And this is very imperative for us, designing for vulnerable communities and populations to be proactive and prepared to think about how our solutions are applied. Especially when a machine is making a decision. Use transparent, interpretable algorithms that can tell you how they work so that the model actually is explainable instead of a model that could just never be explained. A lot of people might be quick to jump to the most exciting, newest neural network, but that could mean increased risk if the model is not interpretable. Be mindful of and discuss the values that are and are not embedded in your algorithm, depending on what model you decide to use. But even when we've made all these considerations, carefully selected an interpretable model, co-designed with the communities, we need to account for trade-offs in our technology. Even with good intentions, biased data, certain algorithms, and the inability to change algorithms can still creep in. So as we acknowledge these trade-offs, here are some questions to consider. I also want to reiterate here that this list is nowhere near exhaustive, and neither is this short presentation. There's lots more to unpack on this topic. But just get started by asking, who will it affect? Who has the power to change it? What risks are we taking? What's the worst that can happen, both if we fail and if we succeed? Are there other ways to get to the results you're looking for? Where you really need to think carefully about data ethics is when you try your best to do good, but you can still do harm. These more subtle considerations are often more dangerous because of how hard they are to spot, but you need to identify potential machine error or human error because they could have severe human consequences. Trade-offs between legitimate human values are inevitable in technology that sort and act upon human lives. So it's essential to ask yourself if changes in power structures that come from this work are transparent, are they just, and are they reversible if you find out they're not as they should be? What trade-offs are you willing to make? So be careful what you optimize for, because your algorithm will not optimize for anything else, as seen in this example video here. So with all that in mind, define your risks and dependencies early on with a mitigation plan, listing all the assumptions and constraints. Recognize the limitations, the pitfalls, and the ethical nuances that could arise throughout the project. understand how work can be misused, and that private data must be safeguarded. We can be both encouraged by what we can produce with data and equally concerned about the potential for misuse or harm to find that balance for maximal positive impact. So now that we've covered all of these scoping considerations needed to build your problem statement and define your data solution in just 42 minutes, you're probably wondering where you can find more information, because this was a quick overview. So just like in scoping a data project, in which we talked about how important it is to start with the questions, not the solution, when we launched the Center of Excellence in 2020, we started with a question. As data science and AI become increasingly accessible and used across the social sector, we are wondering at DataKind, can we ensure ethical and high quality work is done to make a positive impact? And this caused us to build the DataKind playbook so that all of our lessons learned from our failures and from our successes can be codified for use on future projects. So the playbook is a globally accessible, living knowledge base that enables the reader to implement every element of a data for good project following DataKind standards, processes, and best practices. So in particular, you can find many resources on scoping and on ethics, including several resources on ethical scoping in particular. All of this is in the playbook, giving you a deeper dive into everything covered today. So you're not just have these 40 minutes of content to learn from, you can also review the playbook. We've spent over 2 years developing the playbook to capture 10 years of lessons learned and best practices from our experience, and to make it accessible to everyone. So please feel free to explore and share your feedback so that we can always continuously improve it and make it more relevant to you. Finally, we're excited to share our volunteer resources with you as well as part of this Nonprofit Data 101 offering. At the beginning, I explained that this webinar is only half of this offering. Because you've joined this webinar, you also have the opportunity to participate in a free 30-minute one-on-one consultation with an expert on data project scoping who is part of DataKind's scoping squad. So this is a chance to discuss your organizational challenges, how to apply these lessons learned on scoping to your organization, and any specific questions that you have on the scoping process with these folks. We'll share the link in the chat right now, and we'll share the link via email to you tomorrow. And with that, we will, I know for specific questions for your organization with one-on-one time, you've got office hours for that personalized support, but now we do have 10 minutes to take any questions that you want to share that might benefit others. So Sheena, what questions do we have?
Great, thanks so much. So please continue to put your questions in the chat. We know that was a lot of great content, so all questions are good questions. Rachel, one question that came up, how can I connect with subject matter experts and social actors?
Well, it really varies based on your sector and the type of work that you're doing. So that's a really hard one. I guess the main thing is just to use, explore your project area, your problem area, and use the resources in the network that you have, folks that have worked in the space that you're familiar with, and make connections from there and try to find the people who have the most relevance, because it will really vary based on some sectors. Going to conferences is really useful and helps you find researchers. Doing a lot of research online can help find subject matter experts, looking at what has been done and reaching out to the people who have done some of that work. Yeah.
Great, thanks so much. Another question that came in, a good one. By starting with the problem, it feels like we're assuming there's data out there to help answer the question. So for small organizations without large resources who want to start with in-house data, can you discuss the challenges of looking into the data first and what comes up?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the time the reason we start with the problem, not the data, the reason we talk about having multiple problem options and then looking at the data is because we do often find that some of the project ideas aren't feasible with the existing data, but that could lead to deciding to explore new data collection methods or looking elsewhere for data that might address the challenge that you're looking to face. If you're just looking at data and saying, okay, what can we do with this data? You're at risk of spending a lot of time doing something that ends up not being very useful because you haven't started with an actual problem that you're facing. But still, if you want to look at the data specifically, you can really see the different areas that it touches and find all the different constraints and limitations of it by talking about some of this data ethics piece where we look at biases and we look at where data might be missing, and that can help you get started on identifying the realm of possibilities with the data for the project. But I want to make sure I'm fully answering the question. Sheena, did that cover each piece of it, or is there a little more I should go into?
Yes, it was just really asking for what are the types of challenges that come up when in that context. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, absolutely. I did just find it in the chat. So yeah, and I will mention also, you mentioned you're a small organization without large resources. There are tons of open data sets that are free and available online. So even if you don't have large resources, you might be able to find relevant data to help support your question publicly. But with in-house data, I guess the challenge of looking into the data first includes, yeah, I think I've pretty much covered it. But yeah, okay.
And there was a good point made in the chat. If you're in the European Union, there's a lot of open data from governments there. So thank you for that response. Another question that comes up with a lot of smaller organizations that was mentioned, some of us don't yet have a well-articulated theory of change. And so how helpful is it to work with a data scientist to develop that theory of change, or is there another subject matter expert to also consider when thinking of an organization's theory of change?
Yeah, absolutely. So for theory of change, you can work with anyone in the like monitoring and evaluation space from the nonprofit sector side, or even some strategy folks, strategy consultants, data scientists. Also, at DataKind, we do this as part of our process, but this isn't the background of all data scientists. It's not theory of change and logic frames are not data science concepts, they're social sector concepts. And so the subject matter experts to go to there would be like social sector strategy and monitoring and evaluation folks.
Great.
There's lots of great resources on that.
What's the most common challenge you come across in getting non-data stakeholders engaged and excited about data science projects, and how to overcome this?
Oof, yeah. So I think part of I feel like I'm saying the same thing over and over again a little bit, but part of getting folks excited is really making sure it will address a challenge that they face, right? And so we talk about starting with the challenge and the problem and the impact instead of the data solution, because some stakeholders might not be excited about the data solution, but they would be excited to say, hey, we're going to double our reach because by increasing our operational efficiencies, we'll be able to reach twice as many people, or we'll be able to more accurately find the folks who are most vulnerable, who most need our services. We'll be able to get more information to find the right people to serve and really help those who need it the most. And so by focusing on the second half of the problem statement, the impact, then you're able to build buy-in with the large term impact and say, well, here's how we get there. And the data project is just the how. The data project is not the what. Does that make sense?
Thanks for that. The questions are coming in, so bear with us as we get all of these answered for you. Oftentimes, this is a question that came from an attendee. We face difficulties with varying levels of data comfort all the way to data illiteracy. How can in-house data folks better help with sense-making and useful presentation of data for subject matter experts?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Such a good one. So one piece of that is we talked a little bit briefly about avoiding jargon and really being a translator and focusing on only saying things that are interpretable to the audience you're working with. So if you're a data professional and you could have a slide that kind of explains your model, or an output table that would be interesting to data scientists, but your audience can't understand what those output tables mean, then just completely exclude them and simply focus on the results in a way that are accessible to the subject matter experts, and think about what actually translates, and really take the data project and incorporate that so what at the end, the impact, the behavior change you're trying to see, and focus on, okay, we did this data project, but here's the behavior change that it caused, and here's why that matters. And that will hopefully help bring people on board.
Great. There's a couple questions related to kind of following the data literacy theme. If there's no experience in data science, but in being part of the social sector, you want to gain more knowledge and insight, any tips for cultivating and that knowledge of learning about data science?
Yeah, there's lots of different resources available. There's tons of free online courses. I think I saw someone mentioned one in the chat on Coursera, but there's tons of opportunities to just learn from online courses. I would also recommend trying to get started on a project. I think the best way to learn how to do data work is to actually apply it in a real situation. So there's kind of two ways you can go with that. One is by finding some data online and just exploring it, because that will help you build your skills up and seeing what you can do with existing data. But preferably, what I would suggest is figuring out an actual problem that you can solve in your organization with data. And even though you might not be able to build the data solution right now, if you're identifying a problem that's relevant to your organization and going to make a positive impact, and you can build that buy-in, then finding someone to who has the skills to support you, so that you can upskill and learn those skills alongside them and be part of the project as it's being built out. That's a really, really great way to learn, because it's actually applicable, and it's going to keep you motivated to be learning. And then everything that you learn will, in the long term, help you sustain the product that you built and build a long-term solution.
Great. There was a comment made that perhaps you can expand on around looking at the data first is not always a bad thing, sort of explaining the concept of EDA, exploratory data analysis, and how this could generate additional questions or discussion. So if you want to talk a little bit about exploratory data analysis.
Yeah, absolutely. So exploratory data analysis is just saying you have a data set, and let's see what we can find out about it. Let's see what's in there. And so that is what we do. I briefly said a data audit. We do exploratory data analysis as part of our data audit at DataKind, which comes after we've identified some potential projects and potential impacts. And so that helps us identify what insight might be useful to really refine the problem statement. But if you're in a situation where there's just so many possibilities, and maybe your problem statement is something like a strategic question around, we don't really know where to go next. We just have a lack of information, and we need information to make a strategic decision. That is the problem. Then exploratory data analysis is the perfect solution, because it is saying, okay, let's look at the data you have. Let's see what you can find out that might inform a strategic decision. And so that would be an instance where just diving into the data could help really with that initial question of strategy. But then once you do the exploratory data analysis, you might find a more specific outcome or data or some type of correlation or something that makes you want to dive deeper into a follow-up project that would really define the rest of your project.
Great. There was one additional question. This will be the last one. Can you please share differences between the typical activities of a data analyst versus other roles that may be involved in a data project?
Yeah, absolutely. That's been a huge thing recently. So I would kind of put data folks into maybe, well, there's a lot of buckets, but data analysts, data engineers, and then maybe like machine learning data scientists or machine learning engineers are kind of like three big buckets that often folks fall into. So the data engineer is kind of step one. That's the person who gets the data from your Salesforce database, from your survey, from your monitoring and evaluation space, and brings all that data together in a way that is actually usable and readable for someone to interpret. And so a data engineer makes sure the data is structured well and organized, and that it is usable across different platforms. The data analyst is the one who then says, okay, we've got all this data that's usable. What can we get out of it? What are the insights that I can learn? What can I visualize? What kind of should we include in a report? What types of visualization should we include in the report? What can we find out from this data? And then the machine learning engineer, or the AI expert, or the data scientist, someone with the title of data scientist could really be in any of these three camps or in all of them, but in the interest of generalizing, those might be the three buckets. That person is really looking at machine learning models that would maybe automate tasks, that would really be able to learn freely, and some of those more advanced data science type of concepts would fall into that role.
Great. Well, again, I saw lots of questions around how to learn more about DataKind, office scheduling. So I'm going to turn it back to Rachel to share some important closing notes around that. But also, we want you to answer one more quick survey question for us. So Rachel, let me know when you want to launch that and close out.
Yeah. Great. There's so many great comments in here. I'll have to save the chat and would love to follow up with folks if that makes sense. But we are hoping to offer more events like these in the future. And so hopefully you all can stay engaged with us. And so I'll quickly share a few more ways to stay engaged. You can find, people mentioned examples of projects DataKind has done. That is on our blog, on our website right here, datakind.org. So you can find that there. If you want to find out about ways to connect more with the DataKind community, so that then you all in the chat here who are chatting with one another can get to know each other more and be connected as part of the nonprofit community doing data science, subscribe to our newsletter. datakind.org/subscribe will help you find out more about what's going on and what is coming up. And then you can support our work if you'd like by making a donation at datakind.org/donate. So thanks so much for coming today. Please also, last but not least, take our survey, which we'll also put in the chat. It will also be sent along with the recording online after this. And the survey will help us know, since I mentioned this is our first time doing this offering, we want to know what is most valuable to you, how we can best support you as nonprofit professionals. And the survey will answer that for us. So please, please, please fill it out and tell us. I promise we will read it and listen to your answers. So with that, I'll share the closing question results. It looks like most folks have seen a deeper understanding, and some folks are in the somewhat bucket. So that's great to hear. Glad you all got something out of this time, and I look forward to seeing you at future events. Thanks so much for joining us.